Well, today, as you can tell, we have our own rock star, MJ Denis, back with us. She is an expert therapist in the fields of trauma and dealing with infidelity. Many of you absolutely loved her when she was on the first time, and you can watch those videos on YouTube at affairrecovery.com as well. You can find them. All you have to do is go into YouTube and Google infidelity trauma expert, and you pop right up. So thank you to the thousands of you that watched and commented. MJ was unable to answer most, if not all, of the comments, and I did my best. And that video is still being watched by the multitudes. And so we're so grateful that you've come back in today. Today we're going to be talking about the disclosure process, how it affects the betrayed, how it can affect the unfaithful, some do's and don'ts, and basically how to help you both navigate through the disclosure process. It's going to be a great time. Well, thanks for coming back.
Thank you for having me.
It's a great honor that you would come back. People liked you more than they liked me. I'm used to that. It's the way it is. I've come to accept it. So when we're talking about disclosure, and oftentimes in this community of infidelity survivors, we call it D-Day. As an expert therapist and as someone who walks hundreds and thousands of people through this process, give us a good definition of what is a D-Day, what is disclosure for a couple in crisis.
A simple definition of disclosure would be an accounting of betrayal behaviors or an accounting of infidelity. A D-Day, we've called disclosures D-Days because it's a reference to D-Day in World War II,
right.
This time of destruction. And when somebody learns of betrayal or infidelity, their world blows up.
Absolutely. It is a bomb.
Yes, they experience destruction. The world as they have known it is different now.
Right.
And so D-Day, Disclosure Day, with the reference to how destructive it really is.
Now, you said infidelity behaviors, and we didn't talk about this off camera, but I'm going to kind of throw this at you because as we're off to a roaring start, how do you, when you're dealing with clients, spouses both unfaithful and female, what is your working definition of infidelity?
So I actually refer back to a definition of infidelity that I learned from Rick Reynolds, the keeping of secrets. So when I'm working with people and trying to describe what infidelity means, I'll talk about how we can have emotional infidelity if we have an emotional connection with someone else and it is secretive, something we don't share with our spouse. We can have physical infidelity, the physical keeping of secrets that we are not sharing with our partner. We could have financial infidelity, right? If we have an agreement to disclose how we spend money and we have a secretive purchase right? So I like that definition because it's broad and it refers to infidelity is the keeping of secrets. There's some deception or some hiding or some omission.
Especially for those that say, well, it was just emotional. It was just texting or emailing or social media. The fact is, if it's keeping a secret from your mate, it is a form of infidelity.
Yes.
And until we as an unfaithful accept that, would you agree that we just really can't heal?
It's a vital part. Acknowledging the infidelity is the keeping of secrets is important in order to be able to heal, I think, because it gives us an ability to talk about it. It's an acknowledgement. If somebody can say, oh, I was unfaithful because I did these things and I didn't tell you, now we have a different kind of transparency and honesty. Right. So I think from that perspective, you're right. We have to have an acknowledgement of the infidelity and the secretive nature of it in order to heal. Yeah.
Talk about the impact of a disclosure upon the betrayed spouse, and talk about the impact, and this is a touchy subject, but an absolutely necessary discussion. Talk about the impact of multiple disclosures to a betrayed spouse. That is when, an unfaithful spouse says, well, we did this. And then maybe a couple of days later, well, we actually did this. Or it actually was 9 months, not 6 months or 2 months. Talk about how that impacts And incidentally, it's important that you understand as an unfaithful spouse, this is not to shred you. This is not to completely throw you under the bus. Nothing of what I ever do or we do or any guest that we come in is ever going to be about shredding the unfaithful. But it's vital that you as an unfaithful spouse can listen to this discussion about what these multiple disclosures do to the betrayed spouse. And for you betrayed spouses who are living through this ordeal, we want to help you understand what you're feeling is probably normal and give you some ways through it. So kind of speak to the issue.
I think of the impact of disclosures, one or multiple disclosures, in three categories. So I'd like to break it down and talk about the grief impact of disclosures, the physical impact of disclosures, and the trauma impact of disclosures. So if we start with grief. So grief is a human response to loss.
Right.
And so when somebody receives information that their person has been unfaithful, has been keeping secrets, has been doing secretive behavior, there's a loss there. There's a list of losses that happens immediately.
List is the key for the betrayed spouse. There's a list of things they're navigating through.
Instantly. Loss of security, loss of safety, loss of knowing this person. Oh no, you've done something I didn't know about. Who are you?
Right.
What have you been doing? And in that place of loss, people experience really 5 things. So I want to talk about how people experience grief. I didn't make this up.
Right.
This came from my first experience in learning about grief was reading a book called On Grief and Grieving. It was written by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and David Kessler. David Kessler, I did some training with him and really learned how grief impacts people. And so there are five ways people show up in grief. The first one is denial. Well, actually, let me name the 5 and I'll talk about each one individually. So there's denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. And so the way I understand grief, specifically for a betrayed partner who's just heard a disclosure of infidelity, that betrayed partner may initially experience denial. Right. Denial is no, la 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 la, I know, or I can't even. Mm-hmm. And you see my hands. This is a common denial gesture. Denial can happen not only at the beginning, but it can happen every day, any day, at any time of the day. Because as we go through these 5, Samuel, you and I had talked about grief is not linear.
Right.
You do all 5 of these things repetitively in no certain order for an indeterminate amount of time until you heal.
Yeah. And you can bounce around. People used to think, I talk to many betrayed spouses or even unfaithful who are trying to understand their mate, and they're like, well, here's the 5 stages of grief. Shouldn't they be in acceptance yet? Right. No. They can go from denial, acceptance, back to anger, I mean, they can bounce everywhere, right?
Yes. And so denial is one of the ways people experience grief. Anger. Right. And remember, anger, there's a spectrum of anger. Low degree anger is annoyance or irritation, right? High degree anger is rage. And so we think we can have different degrees of anger. Any degree of anger makes sense when we think of it. Someone has experienced loss or a list of losses, and it's normal, natural to have the experience of being angry about those losses.
And anger, and what you've just said is so good. Anger is a part of grieving.
Yes.
It's important that we as unfaithful understand that just because he or she is angry doesn't mean that they're just pissed and need to get over it. They're actually grieving.
Yes.
Through the enormity of what they're feeling. So to a certain point, if they don't get angry, they're not grieving, and if they're not grieving, they're not healing. So and everybody reacts with different levels of anger, right? But
Right.
there should be some anger. So for us as the unfaithful to think that there's not going to be any anger is a bit ludicrous.
Yes. I mean, sometimes people have a hard time tolerating anger, right? Again, another spectrum. Some people do angry really well.
Right.
And some people don't stay with angry for a long time or with much intensity. But the action, the behavior, the feeling of anger makes sense. It is a very human response to loss.
And so, again, it's okay for the betrayed to be angry because they're grieving. And so I think sometimes they feel angry at themselves because
For being angry.
When in reality it's all part of the timeline.
You know, I was thinking, yesterday I had a session with a client who said, I want my spouse to feel whatever she's going to feel. She can own her feelings. You know, I give her permission, not that she needs it, but I give her permission to feel whatever she feels. He said, my problem where the conflict comes in is the behaviors that accompany when she's feeling. She's allowed to be angry, of course, but how she's angry sometimes is hurtful or it causes other problems, and that's where they get stuck. And I can imagine that is true. Well, I know that to be true.
Absolutely.
For maybe all couples.
Well, and I was a control freak. I would say, Samantha, you can be angry, but don't be angry and, ask questions or tell me this or withdraw from me. And I learned that was being extremely controlling.
Right.
Because there has to be the freedom for the betrayed to be angry and within reason act upon their anger, right?
Well, and I think, we have to learn how to manage our anger, learn how to manage any negative emotion, really. And so knowing in the aftermath of disclosure, of learning that our person has betrayed us, and if we experience anger, of course we are. It's a natural grief response. It might come out sideways. I think a way that we can look at this is, while I'm allowed to feel angry, I need to figure out how to express my anger in a way where my behavior is lining up with my values. Because if I value loving someone, but I'm throwing things at them, my behavior is not lining up with my values.
So when a betrayed spouse has had multiple disclosures and they're feeling this intense anger, and rightly so, what do they do?
So another trait of grief is something called bargaining. And the way I understand bargaining is it's like we're wrestling with the loss. So people will often have if-then statements. When it comes to disclosures and learning of betrayal, bargaining might sound like this. If you had told me you felt blank early on in our relationship, then maybe this affair wouldn't have happened.
You've just opened up the portal to millions of people who struggle with infidelity.
Right.
You're exactly right.
If I had known, then I could have stopped this. So if I had prayed harder, God might have changed it. I mean, that's bargaining.
If we'd have been nicer, had more sex, and complimented more and all that stuff, if I had been a man who was making more money,
then
wouldn't
maybe
have cheated.
Something different.
You're absolutely right.
And so that bargaining, again, normal, natural, it's a human response to grief. And it can happen repetitively over the healing process. Another behavior that shows up when grieving is depression. So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross named it as depression. But again, I want to put it on a spectrum. Sadness, there can be a low-grade sadness, and then there can be this profound, I'm so sad, I can't get out of my sadness, depression, right? And so there's all different degrees of sadness. Sometimes our sadness leads us to tears, sometimes we feel melancholy, but feeling some degrees of sadness in response to this list of losses from the disclosure, it's appropriate, it makes sense. Sometimes I hear my clients say, I shouldn't be grieving anymore. I should be over this.
Or you hear the unfaithful say, you should be
Why
over
are
this
you
by
still
now.
right? why aren't you over this yet? Oh my gosh, here we go again. And I tell my clients, we might need to talk about a certain topic one time or 50 times, but we're going to talk about it until you have some resolution and peace, until you move through it. And I feel that is how it is with grief. We grieve until we're finished grieving.
Say that again, because we as the unfaithful say, we've talked about this before, MJ, and we bow up and think, we don't need to be talking about this no more. We've already talked about it. And it's just essential. What you're saying is, it may be once, it may be 50 times, not to throw the unfaithful underneath the bus, but to grieve through it. Is that saying it right?
Yes. That sometimes people take a while to move through their grief, and we have to let them. Recently, we had a pet who passed away, and I have 2 teenage boys, and I really encouraged them to talk about their feelings. Another spectrum, don't have none. Go ahead and grieve. Yeah. You can be angry. You can feel sad. You're going to have moments of acceptance. There are times you're going to push it away and you don't want to talk about this loss. But if we don't move through these stages, these different expressions of grief, it can get stuck. And that's a concern for me as a therapist with my own children, with myself, with the clients I work with. I've learned if we thwart grief, if we try to shut it down and maybe stay in denial, grief can get complicated. It gets stuck. And so we really have to move through, just let ourselves move through the feelings. They always end. If we feel angry, it's like a bell curve, right? We start feeling angry, but it will resolve. Yeah. We're not going to stay there. There's a resolution. If we get sad, it's okay. Ride it out, because it will come down.
And when you get stuck, what do you feel like as a betrayed spouse when you're stuck?
Bitter, resentful, angry. A lot of people, when they get stuck in the anger place. Usually I'll see denial or anger are the 2 stuck places. Denial, I can't, I won't, I'm avoiding, I'm not going to.
I don't want this life. I didn't ask for this life.
Right.
I didn't want this. I don't deserve it. Or I can't believe I'm in this place.
Right.
I was a good little Christian girl or boy. I always did right. I was very kind. I was a good man to my woman. And here I am.
Yes. And
so if you were to maybe outline one big issue for the person that's stuck, male or female, they feel like they are stuck in the anger place or the denial place. What is the most helpful thing, if you were to put your finger on one thing, to help them get unstuck?
One thing, I would say, get out some paper and something to write with. Don't type this, actually write it out. A list of the things that you are angry about. There's something about getting it out, and that helps us move through the anger, acknowledging it, having a written record of, when I think about this disclosure, when I think about the infidelity and betrayal, I feel angry and I think this. I feel angry about that. Boy, I feel resentful of this. Boy, I am bitter about that. The process of acknowledging and naming our experience can help take down the intensity, can start organizing it for us.
Right.
And that process can be really helpful.
Because I've had to do that in my own life. And I know that can be controversial as an unfaithful, but I got stuck at a particular time of how Samantha was left for dead, I was left for dead. We had 3 small kids and I had these list of kind of issues that I was angry about. I was angry at God a little bit. I know that's tough to get, that an unfaithful who caused this collateral damage would be angry at God, but it was true and I had to work through it. But I know for me, what you've just described, I put the word unlock on me. It unlocked this chamber of my kind of brain and my heart that was so angry. And once I unlocked it, it was kind of like I took this breathe out moment and started to kind of process through.
Yeah.
Because talking about these disclosures or multiple disclosures, and we get stuck and we don't know how to get out of it because we're locked in pain.
Yes.
And I think so many viewers are just trying to find a way out of the darkness. So what you're saying is kind of itemizing, understanding, or itemizing so that you can begin to then understand it, because then you can identify it and you can slowly walk out. Am I
Yes.
saying that right?
Yes. And I think of the teapot. You know, if the steam's building in the teapot, we've got to let a little bit of the steam out. We don't want to blow the top off the teapot, right? And so if we humans, if that's a metaphor for us, and we've got all this hurt and pain and grief inside of us, doing the written exercise is the equivalent of letting some steam out of the pot. But it has this extra benefit of starting to organize what's swirling in our head and
Right.
swirling in our heart, and it feels so overwhelming. But when we start looking at it, categories will start emerging. I'm angry about this set of losses that has to do with maybe losing my security. I'm angry about this set of losses that has to do with losing relationships. And so people will start organizing that part of their grief, and that's really helpful.
Rick taught me this. Part of the reasons that a betrayed spouse in this particular discussion can't go right to forgiveness is because they haven't grieved.
Right, correct.
And so I want your opinion on this. From what I've learned, you can't, and it's a misnomer, and unfortunately, it's a huge misnomer in the Christian community that just says, forgive your spouse and everything will be good. And it doesn't work that way, because you may want to forgive them, but if you haven't grieved, you're not going to be able to truly forgive them and diffuse the anger and the trauma and the teapot of unresolved issues inside of you. Would you agree with that?
Okay, in my brain, I hear the words, it's not either or, it's both and. Forgiveness, I think, can initially be a choice and eventually be a reality.
Really? That's beautiful.
So initially, if we have a value system that says, I want to forgive this person, we can initially choose, like, I'm going to try really hard to forgive this person because I value that, and I'm going to choose it. The reality piece comes when people move through, like you said, they move through their grief, the denial, the anger, the bargaining, the sadness, and moments of acceptance. And as we keep moving through those different pieces, we get more and more towards acceptance. And acceptance is what I'm equating with forgiveness.
Okay.
Because at some point those two will intersect. We have, I choose to forgive my person for hurting me. And now I have this acceptance of these losses. And now that A plus B equals, now that feels like real forgiveness. I can get there.